Hi everybody, welcome back to another video. So I want to start with a little background this time. I have a journalism degree. I spent 3 years studying how journalism is supposed to be conducted. I really enjoyed it and I really like everything that journalism in theory is supposed to be. As I watched this video from Vox, it struck me that their complaint isn't necessarily about Fox News per se. Their issue seems to be about when journalists are actually doing the job journalists are supposed to do. So let's have a look.
In an ideal world, political journalism looks like this. On either side, you've got the parties, fighting for the attention of the press. And in the middle, you've got journalists, sorting through what's important and what's just partisan bullshit. This is called gatekeeping, and it's one of the most important things journalists do.
So you're saying anything coming from Democrats is important, and anything coming from Republicans is just partisan bullshit. Right. And by the way, what you're actually describing here is not gatekeeping, it's agenda setting. This article here has a really good description of gatekeeping. Events occur everywhere all of the time and news media just can't cover them all. That's it. Gatekeeping in summary is too many events, not enough time. In journalism, you make gatekeeping decisions in theory based on what is newsworthy. What's being described here, however, as I said before, is agenda setting. Agenda setting is when the news media influences perceived importance of issues. So this is done through the increased coverage of an issue, which leads to the public perceiving that that issue must be important. It's appearing so much. Basically, news outlets are telling people what sort of topics they should be thinking about. It should also be noted that agenda setting can also occur based on what newsworthy stories you choose not to cover. Now, we need to distinguish between the two because, as we're going to see throughout the video, if gatekeeping is properly applied, the three main stories are perfectly legitimate, on different levels of course. The stories are illegitimate, however, if you're attempting to set an agenda.
Political operatives can spin whatever talking points they want, but ultimately it's the journalists who decide what's newsworthy enough to pay attention to. But that is in an ideal world, and we don't live in an ideal world, we live in hell. And in hell, there's Fox News.
So according to you, an ideal world is not one where journalists filter out the spin that political operatives might place on their talking points. Spin is fine, as long as it's coming from the Democrat side. Yeah, I think there's a name for that.
Partisan bullshit.
Yep, that would be the name. Anyway, let's hear what's wrong with Fox News.
Fox exists in this weird in-between space, because it claims to be a news organization, but it's essentially a Republican front group.
I think that statement alone could get a rebuttal, but I'm going to listen to a bit more context before I respond.
The network was founded by GOP political operative Roger Ailes. I'm not sure why he's posing like Shirley Temple in this picture. Good
Naughty
shit.
little Roger.
Ailes spent his career advising Republican presidents like Reagan, Bush Sr., and surprise, surprise, Nixon. A memo from the Nixon Library detailed Ailes' dream of launching a Republican news network, a plan for putting the GOP on TV news, which was described as a way to get around the, quote, prejudices of network news selectors. Wow, nightmares really do come true.
Okay, for argument's sake, let's accept all of that. Now let's compare that with the relationship the Democrats have with the media. So let's start with a couple of people who have worked both in the media and as part of the DNC. George Stephanopoulos is a political journalist at ABC News. In a previous life, however, he worked under Bill Clinton, both before and after Clinton became president. Having worked within a Democrat administration already presents a potential conflict of interest anytime he covers stories about the Democrats. But he also donated to the Clinton Foundation, which he failed to disclose and ended up having to apologize for live on air.
I should have gone the extra mile to avoid even the appearance of a conflict. I apologize to all of you for failing to do that.
Then there's Jay Carney, who was the White House press secretary under Obama. He went on to become a political commentator for CNN while Obama was still in office. Now, to be fair, that would be okay if he wasn't going to be partisan, right? Problem being is, when asked about the position, he made statements like this, which made it clear that he was definitely going to be a partisan political commentator. And then there are times where the media connection to Democrats occurred behind the scenes and only became apparent later on. In January 2015, a media strategy was drafted regarding Hillary Clinton's soon-to-be presidential candidacy. Within that strategy was the suggestion of contacting Maggie Haberman to help shape the narrative of the upcoming presidential bid, because apparently they were never disappointed when they approached her about a story. Now, the timing was also interesting, given that around that time it was announced that Haberman would join the New York Times specifically to serve as the presidential campaign correspondent. And let's not forget CNN political commentator Donna Brazile leaking debate questions to Hillary Clinton while working as the interim chair for the DNC. This led to her being let go from CNN. Now, all of these were bad, sure, but perhaps not as bad as when someone outright admits on air that the media has a political bias towards a particular candidate.
We couldn't help her any more than we have.
I know.
You know what I mean? She's got just a free ride so far from the media. We're the biggest ones promoting her campaign, so it better happen.
So if you're complaining that Roger Ailes created Fox News as a partisan network to sell the message of the GOP, that's a valid concern. But if you're going to start pointing fingers about outlets being a mouthpiece for political parties, you do need to keep in mind that that can easily be shown as happening from the other side as well. Now, what we're going to see next up in the video is some trivial stories that Fox News covered that are supposed to prove that they're a network of partisan hackery. Carlos's words, not mine. So let's have a look at each story they mention, and we'll see what sort of trivial nonsense other networks have covered of a similar type.
Ailes eventually founded Fox News, and with it, he turned partisan hackery into an art form. Obama salutes while holding coffee.
Everyone's talking about the disrespectful way the president saluted a Marine yesterday.
CNN did a segment on how Trump shakes hands.
Clinton coughs during a campaign event.
We all have our coughing spells, but it doesn't look good when you have all these conspiracy theories about her health.
Right.
Oh, come on. Everyone is talking about Trump's health. And they're not just talking about physical health. They're talking about mental health too.
Is Trump mentally unfit to be president? That is an awkward question, but it's one that's being asked on every major news network in America.
That guy looks kind of familiar for some reason.
Rashida Tlaib says a naughty word about Trump.
We're gonna go in there, we're gonna impeach the motherfucker.
Is this what the Democratic Party has become?
Buckle up,
This
folks.
is the new Democratic Party.
This is the Democratic Party in 2019.
Let's assume the controversy wasn't about Rashida Tlaib stating aggressively that she was going to impeach Trump. Let's assume it was just about the naughty word she used. I'm not sure there's even need to rebut the media criticism of how Donald Trump talks, but let's do it anyway.
If the Trump administration were a movie, it would be rated R for language.
So, what point are you making exactly?
Fox knows this fucking bullshit doesn't actually matter, but that's not the point. The point is pretending that it matters, so voters at home think it does too.
Really? That's a Fox News problem, is it? It's not like other outlets are complaining about stupid trivial things like, well, I don't know, Trump throwing paper towels out to a crowd of hurricane victims? Or discussing how he drinks water? Or talking about how many scoops of ice cream he has? Or trying to decipher the meaning of a made-up word in an incomplete tweet that was obviously sent by accident before it was finished? Or how his use of language might be offensive to witches? There was the time that Trump apparently fed koi fish incorrectly. But my absolute favourite, was when the Washington Post wrote over 1,000 words about Trump serving burgers and pizza to a football team that was visiting the White House. It included a costing of the food, it included a diagram, it included a fact check that pointed out that Trump's claim that the burgers were stacked a mile high wasn't actually true. Do you really want to pull at the thread of partisan news outlets focusing on stupid, trivial things and making them seem more important than they are? If so, I could give example after example after example of plenty of outlets that do that very thing, and those outlets don't actually bear the name Fox News.
They're doing political communications. They're finding a weak point, and then they're hammering it very, very relentlessly.
If we go back to earlier this year, there was days of national news coverage from most major outlets about a kid smiling at a Native American man. Do you think Fox was relentlessly hammering a story about a kid in a MAGA hat smiling? And let's not forget the 2 years of partisan outlets relentlessly hammering a point so much that it inspired dance numbers.
Trump-Russian possible collusion.
Trump-Russian metal collusion.
Trump-Russia possible collusion.
Do you think Fox News was behind driving that narrative? And do you really think you're in any position to criticise Fox News for taking a point and hammering it relentlessly, given how many times this show particularly, and the outlet in general, hammers stories complaining about Fox News. And not just about Fox News, but about specific pundits too. Look, I can grant the premise that Fox News probably finds a point and hammers it over and over again. It's not a Fox News issue though. It's a media issue. Stop pretending otherwise.
It's a network that was founded by political operatives. It has a partisan operative mentality, and it works.
As I've already shown, there's a partisan operative mentality of other outlets besides Fox. So I don't think we really need to address that point. I will ask this question though. Why is this Vox video backing up its points with the opinion of someone else from the same outlet? Oh, okay, because he wrote an article about the topic. Fair enough. Now, I assume this article was covering some sort of academic theory, or maybe someone wrote a book about the hack gap, or it's apparently a term that Matthew Iglesias just made up. Great, good job. So essentially, this is a video by Vox, featuring Matthew Iglesias from Vox, explaining an article he wrote for Vox about a concept he himself invented. Really, there's only one way this video could be any lazier, and that's if the host Carlos actually just started talking to himself to further his points.
Now I know what you're thinking.
Oh my god, who cares? It's Fox. None of us actually watch that crap.
Except you do watch that crap, Mary. You just don't realize it.
Wow, Carlos did actually start talking to himself to further his points. And I do have to take back my previous statements. Apparently you can get lazier. Why bother with all the hassle of a proper studio, a proper camera, or a good microphone, when you can just use your low-resolution webcam at home? Awesome work, guys.
Because once Fox News goes all in on a story, other networks pay attention.
Political journalists are very sensitive to complaints about liberal bias.
That's a good thing. Journalism of any type and covering any topic is supposed to be objective. Everyone should be sensitive to their own bias, regardless of what they're covering. I'm not surprised, though, that many journalists are concerned about being viewed as having a liberal bias. When you look at the audience for the majority of the news outlets, their audience falls on the left. I've put the big black line in the middle to highlight the theoretically neutral audience. But as you can see, there are a small handful that have an audience that are right-leaning, but most have an audience that are left-leaning. Back in 2016, the vast majority of online and print jobs were in counties that voted for the Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. 51% of those jobs were in counties that were heavily Democrat, where Clinton won by more than 30 points. Then there was the study from Indiana University examining the party affiliation of journalists. Admittedly, this was from 2013, so it's a few years old now. It found that journalists specifically affiliated with a party were almost 4 times more likely to be affiliated with Democrats than they were to be affiliated with Republicans. Looking at these, they're all reasons why political journalists would and should be wary of political bias. They cater to, and they're frequently surrounded by, one side of the political spectrum. It's something they need to be wary of.
And so one thing they do is they overcompensate by paying a lot of attention to what's going on in conservative media. What's in conservative media? What are conservatives talking about? Let's elevate this. Let's take it seriously, even if I don't personally agree with it.
Wow, that last sentence was amazing. I think we need to hear it again.
Let's elevate this. Let's take it seriously, even if I don't personally agree with it.
That's journalism. You're describing journalism. Any personal agreement or disagreement you may have with a subject matter broadly or a story specifically is irrelevant. Is it factual, regardless of whether or not you like what those facts are? Is it factual, and is it equally or more newsworthy than other stories that you may need to fit into airtime or print space, assuming that's a consideration for the type of outlet that you're at? If you're asking those questions, then you're gatekeeping and you're doing journalism as it's supposed to be done. But if you're only elevating stories of things you like or agree with, well, quite frankly, at that point, you've stopped being a journalist.
Take Benghazi, for example. I'm still mad about this. In 2012, Fox began peddling wild conspiracy theories about a terror attack in Benghazi.
Look, I don't know for sure what the conspiracy theory is supposed to be. Based on the clips we're about to see, I assume the conspiracy theory is that the Obama administration was covering something up regarding the events. This is apparently how Fox News reported the story.
Explosive new details about a possible White House cover-up on Benghazi.
Unanswered questions about Benghazi.
Questions still remain unanswered.
Some have suggested this is bigger than Watergate.
And this next montage, which I've taken from a little later in the video and placed here, is apparently other outlets following the talking points of Fox.
Aren't there still legitimate questions to be answered on Benghazi?
Very serious, unanswered questions.
Legitimate questions. Too many questions.
It's not just for Fox News anymore. It's all of cable news.
So based on what we just saw and what we're about to hear, the claim seems to be that the reporting on Fox influenced the other networks to also report on Benghazi. I'll explain why that's not true in a minute, but for the moment, let's keep going.
Fox's goal was to smear the Obama administration, sure, but it was also to get other news outlets to take that smear seriously.
At first blush, I think most journalists would be inclined to mostly ignore that. It wasn't nothing, but it just wasn't like the biggest news story in the world.
4 Americans were killed at Benghazi, and one of them was an ambassador for the United States. That makes it newsworthy. This event happened exactly 8 weeks prior to the day Obama was seeking re-election. That makes it newsworthy. It happened on an anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. That made it newsworthy. Obama and Clinton addressed the media both the day after the attack happened and 3 days after the attack when the bodies of those killed were returned to the US. That event made it newsworthy. There were inconsistent statements coming from members of the Obama administration regarding what happened.
The Obama administration was quick to cite the video and claim that this was a spontaneous attack, and very slow to acknowledge what the attack on Benghazi was, a planned terrorist attack.
Again, I think this is what the apparent conspiracy theory is about. But conflicting stories coming from the White House was and is newsworthy. If you as a journalist weren't asking questions about those conflicts, then you're very bad at your job. I'm sure there's more that I'm not even thinking about. Even if you want to be critical at how Fox News spun the story, when looking at it through the gatekeeping lens, this was a massive story that any decent outlet had to cover. But Carlos and Matthew are viewing it through the agenda-setting lens. That's why, rather than seeing all the clear news values that made up this story, Carlos thinks the reason the story appeared on Fox is because
Fox's goal was to smear the Obama administration.
And Matthew thinks
it wasn't nothing, but it just wasn't like the biggest news story in the world.
So given that this is their view, what reason do they give for the other stations running the story?
But it's on Fox. It's on Fox. You hear about it more.
Why is the media not dealing with a clear cover-up here?
And you say to yourself, okay, I don't want to be biased. I need to incorporate this into my news diet, into my reporting.
And eventually, Mary, it worked.
So that montage I showed earlier came from this part here and was clearly trying to demonstrate news outlets covering Benghazi just because Fox did. But let's break down these clips. I've mostly sorted them into the chronological order that they aired to see what was actually being covered. The first clip is from the show Anderson Cooper 360. It aired November 14, 2012, more than 9 weeks after the Benghazi incident. The segment that we saw was about a conflict between the newly elected Barack Obama and John McCain. The conflict was about a potential appointment of Susan Rice to the Secretary of State. There was even an interview with John McCain a little bit later in the segment. Next up is a clip that aired on The Cycle on November 28, 2012. It was talking about a meeting between Susan Rice and 2 Republican members of Congress. The meeting was regarding the very same potential appointment of Susan Rice. One clip that we saw was from the finance program Your Money. It aired on June 2nd, 2013, and it wasn't even really about Benghazi. It simply highlighted some of the conversations that were happening that prevented discussions about the US economy. And this clip here was from one of the CNN newsroom shows. It aired October 11, 2015, 3 years after Benghazi. They were discussing Benghazi because of a story CNN themselves had broken regarding the House Select Committee and how they were running their inquiries into the Benghazi incident. But this last clip is the most amazing clip that's shown. It's from the Rachel Maddow show that aired on May 17, 2013. Let's hear the clip again that Vox presented.
It's not just for Fox News anymore. It's all of cable news.
So obviously this was meant to re-emphasize the point that Fox talked about Benghazi and all other outlets picked that up. But let's hear what came before and after the clip.
The ABC report on Friday caused all 3 network newscasts to report on the scandal of Benghazi. And then Sunday morning, oh boy, it was all 4 Sunday morning talk shows. ABC and NBC and CBS and Fox News Sunday, all leading with Benghazi. Wow, thanks, Jonathan Karl. Thanks, ABC.
So Vox's clip was trying to emphasize Fox News broadcasting false stories about Benghazi that other outlets then picked up and ran with. But it's actually from a segment criticizing ABC for doing that very thing. That's awesome. So not only did all of these clips come well after the Benghazi attack, with the earliest being 9 weeks after, all of these stories had legitimate news values in and of themselves. There's only one reason why you would think these outlets shouldn't have covered Benghazi. You don't want Benghazi to be viewed as important, and as such you want coverage to either be reduced or eliminated entirely. There's a word for that.
So the result of that is that there's incredible agenda-setting power in AM talk radio and Fox News. They all go talk about something, no matter how sort of crazy or unimportant it is. It gets on the news agenda and it gets covered by the mainstream.
We heard it right there. The concern at Vox is not gatekeeping, as they alluded to earlier, it's agenda setting. Now again, I don't know for sure what aspect of the Benghazi story he's regarding as crazy. My guess, as I said before, would be the inconsistent statements, which any good journalist should question. But regardless of what the crazy aspect of the Benghazi story is, one description you couldn't give that story is unimportant. And to re-emphasize what I've said earlier in the video, agenda setting is not just about what stories you cover, it's also about what stories you avoid covering. The killing of 4 American nationals overseas in a terrorist attack is the very definition of a newsworthy story. So if you decide it's something that needs little to no coverage, there's no way you reach that decision if you're looking at it through the lens of journalism.
There's no equivalent to this on the left, and that creates what Matt calls a hack gap. Because conservatives can manufacture their own outrage cycles, mainstream outlets pay a lot more attention to their bullshit, which means even minor slip-ups by Democrats can become career-defining scandals.
If that's what you mean by the hack gap, then I have to say it doesn't exist. Because there's absolutely instances of outlets on the left manufacturing a controversy and then mainstream media picking it up and running with it. I've already mentioned a couple of examples I could expand on to disprove that, like Covington and the Russia conspiracy, but let's look at a different example just to hammer home the point. Let's go back to the 3rd of October 2016. Donald Trump went and talked to a veterans pack called the Retired American Warriors. He took several questions from veterans while he was there. This is one of the questions that Trump took and the answer he gave. It's a slightly abridged version, but it's more than long enough to hear the proper context.
Good morning, Mr. Trump. As you mentioned, there's a tragic suicide epidemic among our veterans. So my question for you is, when you become president, will you support and fund a more holistic approach to solve the problems and issues of veteran suicide, PTSD, TBI, and other related military mental and behavioral health issues?
Yes, I would. Look, we need that so badly. When you talk about the mental health problems, when people come back from war and combat and they see things that maybe a lot of the folks in this room have seen many times over, and you're strong and you can handle it, but a lot of people can't handle it. And they see horror stories, they see events that you couldn't see in a movie, nobody would believe it. When you hear the 22 suicides a day, that should never be. That should never be. And the whole mental health issue is going to be a very important issue when I take over. And the VA is going to be fixed in so many ways, but that's going to be one of the ways we're going to help. And that's, in many respects, going to be the number one thing we have to do, because I think it's really been left behind. Okay? Thank you very much.
So as we can see, Trump acknowledged the problem and put forward his intention to tackle the issue. But how did news outlets cover it? Well, they suggested that he was denigrating veterans. These are some of the stories that were released the same day as the event. This resulted in other outlets picking up that idea and running with it. Chris Cuomo asked Joe Biden about it the next day when he was interviewing him. MSNBC got a perspective from a vet and another perspective from Ben Carson about the apparent controversy. But the problem was, Trump wasn't disrespecting or belittling those suffering from PTSD. This was a point that even the soldier who asked the question pointed out. But a controversy was manufactured and it was picked up by the mainstream media, something that you just claimed doesn't happen. This absolutely happens in the other direction. At best, at absolute best, you could maybe say there is no single news outlet on the left that manufactures controversy, but it definitely happens in the other direction. Once again, there is no hack gap.
In March, Democrat Ilhan Omar gave a speech about how Muslim organizations had to fight Islamophobia after 9/11.
They recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties.
Pretty non-controversial, right? Wrong again, Mary. Because in April, Republican Dan Crenshaw accused Omar of trivializing 9/11. Because she didn't say the word terrorist, I guess.
Well, if you actually read the tweet, I think what he takes exception to is the dismissal by Ilhan Omar, both of the perpetrators who committed a heinous act and all the innocent people who died in that attack. Nearly 3,000 people died in September the 11th. Over 3,000 kids lost at least one parent. It was the biggest terrorist act in the US and was one of the darkest days in the history of the country. I'm not American, and even I can understand why people would take exception when a terrorist attack that led to thousands of deaths is described as
Some people did something.
As a member of the media, a big part of your job is comprehending things so you can then relay them to the general public in a way they can understand. If you're not able to do that, maybe you need to find another job.
And the next morning, Fox News knew what it had to do.
Really? Few people did something? You have to wonder if she's an American first.
Downplaying one of the darkest days in our nation's history.
The Democratic Party has a problem.
Ilhan Omar is embroiled in another controversy today.
After making controversial comments,
Do you feel she should apologize? Do you think she should have rethought her words?
How do you think this controversy is playing out among Democrats?
The Congresswoman needs to be careful about her own words, too.
So again, we saw that Fox apparently ran a whole bunch of stories, which resulted in other outlets having to pick up the story and also run with it. But is this actually what happened? Let's break down each of the clips we just saw in chronological order and see if it's actually true. So first to air was Fox and Friends, which was on April 10th. The next day, April 11th, we saw a segment from Today on NBC, and we saw two segments from MSNBC, one hosted by Haley Jackson and one by Katie Tur. 2 days after those three segments, there was a segment on the Fox show Waters World, where Jesse Waters talked to Dan Crenshaw. Jesse actually referenced some other media coverage, including one of the segments by MSNBC. The day after Waters World, the 14th, there were two more segments by MSNBC. And finally, 5 days after the original Fox segment on April 15th, there was a segment on the Fox show The Ingram Angle. So the notion that Fox News hammered this story and it led to other channels picking it up is clearly not true, at least according to the clips we were provided. In fact, given what we just saw, 4 segments were by MSNBC and one of the Fox segments actually referenced MSNBC. So wouldn't it be more reasonable to say that MSNBC were more responsible for driving this story? Just a thought.
This is the kind of hacky nonsense that good gatekeeping is supposed to protect us from. And it almost did. Nobody even cared about Omar's speech for weeks after she gave it. But once Fox made it a story, it was over. Look at how many mainstream news segments included clips from Fox.
Does anyone else reckon when they wrote and recorded the line,
Look at how many mainstream news segments included clips from Fox.
They thought they were going to find more than 2 examples? And by the way, one of the 2 clips where apparently the show referenced Fox News is because they were showing a comment from Dan Crenshaw. And there's a reason for that. This story didn't become newsworthy because Fox decided to comment on a nearly 3-week-old speech. It became newsworthy because Dan Crenshaw commented on the statement we saw earlier. That's why Fox showed Crenshaw's tweet in the very first segment. That's why the MSNBC segment we just saw also referenced the original tweet. That's why NBC sat down and talked to Crenshaw about this. By the way, there was a cover of the New York Post that was directly referenced and displayed in many of these segments. Why is the New York Post not considered to be the driving force behind this becoming such a big story? And this is before we even look at the numerous articles from the same day the Fox segment first aired. Fox wasn't the only news outlet covering this story, and to suggest that they are the reason this became newsworthy means you have to ignore all other coverage that the original Dan Crenshaw tweet got. Anyway, let's move on to the next story.
The hack gap is a nightmare in a normal year, but it's especially bad during election season. In 2016...
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt for a second to say, remember that date, 2016. I'm also going to let the next little bit play for a bit longer, because there are some claims made as to why the next story actually became a story, and they're just not true. So let's have a listen.
In 2016, a lot of journalists realized that the Clinton email server was not the national crisis Fox was making it out to be.
Could this new development put her behind bars?
You've got destruction of evidence. You've got obstruction of justice.
There's 3 specific laws that we found.
There's at least 7 that I've found.
Lock her up.
Yes, lock her up.
Oh, that pleases me.
But because Fox viewers became fixated on Hillary's emails, the story became newsworthy.
So yeah, that whole idea...
Because Fox viewers became fixated on Hillary's emails, the story became newsworthy.
...is based on 2 completely wrong pieces of information. Firstly, this story was originally broken by the New York Times, not Fox. And secondly, the story broke in 2015, not 2016. Now, to be fair, Vox did say that it didn't really become a story until the viewers of Fox News picked it up and really ran with it, and then that kind of made it into something that was newsworthy. So maybe there were no outlets that were covering it when it first broke in 2015.
Turns out the Secretary of State of the United States used a personal email account for official sensitive business for 4 years. That's what the New York Times is reporting this morning.
Okay, well that's just one example.
As first reported in the New York Times, Clinton exclusively used her personal email account as Secretary of State instead of a government email, now required.
2 examples.
According to a new report from the New York Times.
According to the New York Times reporting
5 examples?
According to the New York Times.
According to the New York Times tonight.
The New York Times reports.
Yeah, you know what? Let's just move on.
I remember talking to somebody who was a high-ranking official at a major newspaper, and I was asking him, why did you guys have so much emails coverage? And he said, well, I think that the email story spoke to some of the electorate's fundamental doubts about Hillary Clinton.
This story developed over more than 18 months. The original story broke 2 days into March 2015. Developments ran right through to November 6, 2 days before the 2016 election. There were several releases of emails. An FBI investigation was opened. After the investigation was theoretically closed, it was reopened about 11 days before the election. There was a 15-minute press conference explaining in detail exactly what the FBI investigation entailed. There is speculation that the FBI reopening the investigation just before the 2016 election may have actually cost Clinton the presidency. This was a massive story that had to be covered from several different angles. If the conversation occurred how we were just told, then you're both horrifically incompetent journalists. But assuming this is accurate, apparently the story had to be run because of doubts about Hillary Clinton. What does Matthew attribute those doubts to?
Okay, fair enough. But where did those doubts come from? They came from Fox News. They came from conservative talk radio. So you put this stuff out, then it becomes a true fact that many people are worried about this email server. And then that becomes a controversy that you cover.
Look, doubts about Hillary Clinton do not just come from conservative talk radio or Fox. They come from her own words. In the past, she's made several claims about a trip to Bosnia and exactly how the events played out on that day. There was a CBS report showing that she's made these claims at several different events. It turned out that it didn't happen the way she described it. She's constantly changing political positions, as brought up by Anderson Cooper in one of the Democratic presidential debates. She even seems to lie about simple things like family history. BuzzFeed, an online outlet that is far from conservative, corrected Clinton regarding the country her grandparents came from. She garners mistrust not because of media coverage, but because she's frequently dishonest. And again, the story about her emails wasn't even from Fox News. While I'm sure it was covered by Fox, it was also covered extensively by other outlets.
Years later, when it turns out that the Trump White House is also using unsecured communication lines, it doesn't spark the same months-long crisis that Hillary's emails did, because there's no left-wing propaganda machine baiting journalists into overreacting.
As far as I'm aware, so far this story is basically Trump used the wrong phone and there's concern that foreign powers can listen in. Unless that turns into a criminal investigation or some sort of congressional hearing, you can't really get months-long reporting out of that. But that doesn't mean there isn't a left-wing propaganda machine that inflates the importance of other stories. For example, 5 days of national news coverage about a 16-year-old kid smiling was the product of a left-wing propaganda machine. 2 years of
Trump-Russian possible collusion. Trump-Russian metal collusion. Trump-Russia possible collusion.
That turned out not to be true was the result of a left-wing propaganda machine. This absolutely happens from the other side, and if you think it doesn't, you're ignoring reality.
It's not that there's nothing to these stories. Clinton's email server was a mistake. Benghazi was a mess. Omar could have said the word terrorists more, I guess. Oh god, it's in my ear now. It's that they get blown way out of proportion by a propaganda machine that's trying to score political points, and by mainstream journalists who are too afraid of looking biased against conservatives to call bullshit.
Benghazi was a terrorist attack that resulted in the death of 4 Americans on foreign soil. It resulted in 10 investigations over a 3-year period. Regarding the email story, Hillary engaged in actions that resulted in a months-long FBI investigation, which in part was trying to determine whether she should be criminally charged. In this video, you've essentially said they're as unimportant as Obama saluting, Hillary coughing, or Rashida Tlaib swearing. Not sure you're the best judge on whether the level of response given by news media to a story is proportionally appropriate.
And the weird genius of the hack gap is that if you're not watching Fox News, you won't even notice it, because it doesn't look like Fox and Friends or Hannity. It looks like serious journalists covering a serious controversy that they've decided is important. But they aren't deciding. They're reacting to a political operation that was created to get you to pay attention.
Okay, there's a problem with that theory. You think outlets were reacting to Fox regarding a story that the New York Times broke and pretty much every other outlet picked up. You think Fox was responsible for driving the stories about Benghazi more than 2 months after the event. How is it possible that Fox can be the driving source behind a story with such a massive time delay, or more importantly, when it's not even their story? I'll say this for the final time. It's because you don't see stories from the perspective of gatekeeping, whether or not they're newsworthy. You see stories from the perspective of agenda setting. You think that if it suits or benefits the conservative agenda, it must be a story coming from a conservative outlet. We actually saw it right at the start of the video.
You've got journalists sorting through what's important and what's just partisan bullshit.
So apparently any story that comes from the Republican Party is partisan bullshit.
It's the journalists who decide what's newsworthy enough to pay attention to.
And only stories coming from the Democrats are newsworthy. So if the Republicans only spin partisan bullshit and their stuff is never newsworthy, anything that is beneficial to their agenda could only have become newsworthy if Fox News had pushed it into prominence. Because no real journalist would ever have covered such stories, except that they did.
You can try to ignore Fox News all you want, but as long as journalists are getting their story assignments from conservative media, you can't escape it.
Yeah, you know the awkward thing about this whole video? There's actually an article that has gathered data to show that Fox News is covering vastly different topics than other networks. Now, obviously, this would disprove the idea of the hack gap. If the whole point of the hack gap is Fox News covers something and by extension forces other outlets to cover it, that notion kind of falls apart if the data shows that Fox News and other outlets are actually covering different stories. And what outlet did this article appear on? It appeared on Vox. So if even the people you work with think the mainstream outlets don't cover the stories that appear on Fox, why should we believe that they do? Thanks for listening, everyone. Talk to you again soon.